Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
A new song for you. Kind of a short refrain. This refrain is adopted from an homily, ancient homily of Pope St. Leo the Great. And again, I'll sing this refrain twice at the beginning and do some verses. Please feel free to sing along whenever you feel like it. As we have died with you, we are raised to a new life in you. Change us into what we receive. As we have died with you, we are raised to a new life in you. Change us into what we receive. In this bread of sincerity and truth, the leaven of our malice tossed away by your love, creatures new and gladdened by the Lord's own self, we born again in water share your death. As we have died with you, we are raised to a new life in you. Change us into what we receive. Lead us to that rich and fertile land. Lead us as a shepherd, we who come to the rock. We, your sheep, are nourished by your ever-flowing love. We offer you what you have offered us. As we have died with you, we are raised to a new life in you. Change us into what we receive. You might have noticed that's one of those great mystagogical texts post-Easter from that great era, of course, of the church when theologians were how did my Bruno used to say it? When bishops were theologians and theologians were mystics. I ran into this thing the other day, and I meant to share it with you this morning. This kind of goes along with what I said from that Frederick Buechner quote, "The place God calls you is where your deep joy meets the world's deep gladness." There's this new movie out about Flannery O'Connor called Wildcat, done by Ethan Hawke, rather young filmmaker. It's getting really good reviews. My friends who have seen it really like it a lot. You know, the great Catholic novelist, short story writer, Flannery O'Connor. I heard, the filmmaker interviewed the other day. His name was Ethan Hawke. And I wasn't expecting much from the interview, but he really knows his Catholic theology quite well. And he, at one point in the middle of this interview, he said something very much like the Frederick Buechner quote, talking about, Flannery O'Connor giving glory to God by being a novelist and he himself giving glory to God by being an actor and a film director. He says, God is telling you what you are by what you love. God is telling you about what you are by what you love. And if you get close to what you love expands. And in the pursuit of excellence in any talent you were given, you do honor to your Maker. God is telling you what you are by what you love. And if you get close to what you love expands. And in the pursuit of excellence in any talent you were given, you do honor to your Maker. I think that's really, really good spirituality there. And this guy's also talking quite a bit about the cross and about the hardship of the spiritual life too. So it's not like it's all wine and roses. Okay, next step here. I wanted to tell you a little bit more about the charism of my own monastic congregation, the Camaldolese Benedictines. As far as I know, we're the only. I have my volume turned down. Is that better? You hear me okay? Okay. As far as I know, we're the only congregation of Benedictine that always introduces ourselves with its proper adjectival name. I don't hear other Benedictines refer to themselves as Olivetan Benedictines or Cassinese Benedictines, but we always say Camaldolese Benedictines. We're also the only congregation, so I was told by a Benedictine abbot, that dares to add any other initials to the sacred OSB. We are OSB Cam, which every now and then some people think it's OSB Carm. So I'm a Benedictine Carmelite. But no, it's OSB Cam for the Camaldolese. Though we've been based on the rule of Benedict from the beginning, St. Romuald was called the father of the sensible hermits who lived under the rule. We've always had regular observance monasteries besides hermitages, and at some point in our history, there were more monasteries than hermitages. But we were only brought into the Benedictine Confederation in 1968. And not all of our monks were pleased with that, by the way, since we were considered a separate order. So our little spiritual pride there, we were ERE-CAM, Eremiti Camaldolese. And not all the Benedictines were all that pleased with having us either. So it's always been a bit of a rocky relationship. And I think the concession was to allow us the CAM. Anyway, put briefly, we're an 11th century reform of Benedictine monasticism. Most Christian monks in Europe at the time were what we call cenobites, which you'll know that means basically living in community, contemplative life of prayer, work, and study together. And those are the three pillars, of course, of Benedictine life: prayer, work, and study. But our founder, Romuald of Ravenna, intentionally, specifically, I want to say, added two wings to the body of monasticism, to our charism. Let's say the body is the community life. But first of all, Romuald, and this is what he's mainly known for, brought in the possibility of living greater and greater solitude, a kind of monasticism that was very common, as you know, in the early days of Christianity, especially in the deserts of Egypt, with the possibility even of living as a recluse with virtually no communal life of prayer, work, or socializing. And that's what Romuald's mainly known for. He's the father of the sensible hermits who lived under a rule. And that really was very much the way he preferred to live himself. He actually died in hermitage. But some of our earliest monks, our first monks, first disciples of Romuald, were also missionary martyrs. And those words always go together, not just martyrs, not just missionary. They were missionary martyrs. They went into the lands that were at the time still very hostile among the barbarian tribes. As hard as it is to imagine now, I'm talking about Poland and Hungary, which are very dangerous places to go. And so from the earliest days, our congregation has had what we call the triplex bonum. Make sure I get all my slides in here. I didn't mark where my slides were this time. There it is, the triplex bonum of community, solitude, and this third thing, which we don't usually like the name, but it was originally missionary martyrdom. Actually, what it was called in the earliest writings was Evangelium Paganorum, a very unpolitic, politically incorrect term right now, the evangelization of the pagans. We tend to think, though, of this third good as some kind of total self-donation, some kind of absolute availability to the Spirit. And at times, even reclusion, total solitude, was considered to be the equivalent of martyrdom, as the ancients would call it, a kind of a white martyrdom instead of a red martyrdom. Our former prior general, Emanuele Bargellini, who just died last year, thought that this third good of absolute availability was the thing that was supposed to inspire our entire life, no matter where we are, no matter what we're doing. My martyrdom might be tending to a sick brother, it might be cleaning the kitchen, it might be serving as a superior, when I'd rather be doing whatever it is. Now, the reason I bring that up is there was this document that was discovered only in the 19th century that contains two writings that our monks had lost for centuries. It's called The Life of the Five Brothers, and it's the story of those first monks who went off to the foreign lands and got martyred for it. It was written by one of our early great saints, St. Bruno of Querfurt, who himself was martyred with 18 companions on the border of Russia. Mind you, these first monks who went to Poland weren't doing any kind of active evangelization. They were just living their contemplative life in the midst of a hostile people, thinking that that witness would be enough in the heart of the church. So first of all, this document called The Life of the Five Brothers names this threefold good, this triplex bonum, very succinctly in this paragraph, where it says that this would provide a nice cenobium for those newly come to the from the world, gold and solitude for the mature members thirsting for the living God, and preaching of the gospel for those who are eager to depart and be with Christ. You might recognize that phrase. It's borrowed from St. Paul's letter to the Philippians when he's speaking about his approaching death. And he says, actually, it's usually translated as, my desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that's far better. But what I found interesting, and this is because I'm a nerd with too much time on my hands, I went back to the original Latin documents to see what that word actually was. And the Latin phrase in the life is actually translated as dissolvi, for those who cupientibus dissolve et esse cum Christo. For those who wish to, isn't that beautiful poetry? Those who wish to dissolve and be with Christ. Our Italians, you see the second word there is sciogliersi. They translate that also as dissolve or break apart. Those who wish to sciogliersi and be with Christ. Our expert translator warned me that I might be seeing too much into this, but I love this notion and I'm kind of savoring it as a mantra. It's kind of like what I talked about earlier, the yeast and the salt, and the seed. For those who wish to dissolve to be with Christ. I'm not really longing for death to go to heaven so much as I want to dissolve and be with Christ, even in this life. Anyway, the other thing that's contained in that same writing, The Life of the Five Brothers, is, there it goes, is what's known as the Brief Rule of St. Romuald. It's the only writing, the only actual words we have of the great saint, so we really cherish it. It's basically for the other wing, for the hermit wing, for the solitary. I would call it that, the rule for the hermitage, for the cell. And it's got two very famous lines in it. It opens up with the words, sit in your cell as if in paradise. And the other one is toward the end. It's usually translated this way. And this is kind of I think the motto of the Camaldolese is, at least in America. Empty yourself completely and sit waiting, content with the grace of God. That's quite an attractive phrase. Empty yourself completely and sit waiting. My same classmate, the one who liked to look as miserable as possible for the edification of our guests, used to joke about the fact that the rule begins with the word sit in your cell as if in paradise, and it ends with the word sit, and sit waiting. So the really brief rule of St. Romuald is just sit. Now, another one of our fine translators translated that phrase instead as destroy yourself completely and sit waiting, content with the grace of God. And I found that really shocking. So again, I went back and looked at both the Latin and the Italian of this. And in the Latin, the verb is actually destrue, which the Italians translate even worse. They translated as, I'm sorry, I have it wrong. They translate it as annientati, annihilate yourself completely. Now, when I was speaking with our linguists about this, I've come to think that something between empty and destroy is probably best. And if it weren't so awkward and unpoetic, we might say something like deconstruct yourself. Because destrue is the opposite of construct. So instead of construct, deconstruct. Take this apart. Dismantle this. Deconstruct yourself completely and sit waiting, content with the grace of God. Again, kind of like the dissolve, kind of like the seed, like the yeast, like the salt. Now, here's the thing about it, if you haven't noticed this already. What's pretty fascinating here is that the advice to the solitary hermit is basically the same advice to the missionary: to forget the self, to go beyond the self, to let the self dissolve, to deconstruct this false self that we've built up and or let be built up around us, to deconstruct this persona, this narrative. In a sense, what I'm saying is there's also two sides to this kenosis, to this self-emptying. That self-emptying could be done in giving your life over to missionary martyrdom, to be giving yourself over in service, or that self-emptying can be done just sitting there before God as if in paradise. It's still, the important thing is just to go beyond that self, however we do it. I want to add in there too, and Father Bede certainly Bede Griffiths would back me up on this. You can go beyond the self just by loving someone so deeply that, in a sense, your own sense of self disappears, if it's done in a healthy way. And perhaps in between those two is that great phrase that we sang just yesterday: I no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. One of my all-time favorite prayers, it's another kind of a mantra for me, is from the third step of Alcoholics Anonymous. I love this phrase: relieve me of the bondage of self. Don't relieve me of the self, because we believe there's an abiding self that stays forever in relationship with God, even a kind of a mystical marriage after death. But the bondage of self, what's the bondage of the self? Those attachments, those compulsivities, those addictions, those things that tyrannize my emotions, those things that manipulate my behaviors, those things that keep me unfree, like we were talking about in the last conference, those things that have me enslaved. Relieve me of the bondage of self, the attachments and addictions that tyrannize my emotions and manipulate my behaviors. This little phrase, bondage of self, I find very attractive. And I found it in another place, echoed in a translation of a Sufi mystic. This is a 15th century poet named Jami. He says, although you attempt to do 100 things in this world, only love will give you release from the bondage of yourself. Throw that in there, because this love is very important, because this process I mentioned here, it doesn't end in just destruction and annihilation. There's part of this Sufi teaching that I love very, very much. The word is fana, F-A-N-A. Again, it usually gets translated as annihilation, but it doesn't mean annihilation in the sense that something from outside of us annihilates us and destroys us. It's more like that second phrase I have written there: till the self is forgotten and God is remembered. I no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Till self is forgotten and God is remembered. And you know, this great love poetry that comes out of the Sufi tradition, like a Hafez or Rabia or Rumi himself, the most famous one of all. It's all about this. My favorite little story that I got from the Rumi tradition, that the lover goes to the home of the beloved, knocks on the door, and the beloved calls out, "Who is it?" And the lover says, "It is I." And the beloved says, "Go away, go away." So the lover comes back the next day, pounds on the door. "Who is it?" "It is I." "Go away, go away." So weeks pass by and the lover is bereft. Finally comes back to the home of the beloved, knocks on the door. A voice comes from within. "Who is it?" And the lover says, "It's you." And the door opens. Till self is forgotten and God is remembered. What happens there? What happens there? Just like John of the Cross's great love poetry, just like the cross is followed by the resurrection, just like Good Friday is followed by Easter. In the Sufi tradition, they talk about something that happens after this self being forgotten, or this self dissolving, or this self being deconstructed. They call it a baka, a revival. One of the great Sufi scholars named A.J. Arbery calls this continuance, this passing away from self. Mystics don't actually cease to exist as an individual. Instead, what happens is that our individuality, which is our inalienable gift from God, gets perfected, transmuted, externalized through and in God, echoing Paul's sentiments that he'd rather depart to be with God. This return to a continued existence becomes a source of trial and affliction when we're apart and veiled from God. And so the Sufi poets, like the author of the Song of Songs, use this imagery of longing for the beloved, yearning for the beloved, all the while paradoxically taking this intense joy in the suffering which this separation causes. You might remember this theme also from the writings of Gregory of Nyssa. This desire, the longing, somehow is the thing. This dual sense of separation and union that many of the Sufi mystics refer to in their poetry. And again, this theme echoed in the Song of Songs and St. John of the Cross. But and after this, the self is forgotten, there's this great revival, a revivification that's actually a return to the self, but a return to the enhanced self. The self hasn't been destroyed. The self has actually been brought to its fruition, like Jesus coming bounding from the grave. And you could see Jesus' crucifixion as the ultimate annihilation, the ultimate fana, but we could equally see his resurrection as the ultimate baka, this ultimate revivification. Jesus survived the abject suffering of his body, his physical being. He survived the stripping away of all the layers of his psyche, everything he held dear, anything he could have possibly held on to as a self-identity, even being stripped naked in front of people on a hilltop. And he even survived the desolation of his spiritual being, you might say, his own sense of union with God when he cries out from the cross, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you abandoned me? Stripped of everything. And then, in our tradition, we read the Song of Songs the week after Easter. He comes back leaping the mountains and bounding the hills on the third day. There's a huge message in all this for us. And this is one of those things that separates us, in a sense, from the Asian traditions that think the self disappears like a dropper into the ocean, or that it just is never made of anything permanent anyway, it just evaporates. No, to our surprise, our union with God, this dissolving of the self, doesn't destroy our natural capacities, doesn't destroy our real self hidden with Christ in God. It fulfills our natural capacities and brings us really to the fullness of our selfhood as well. The Sufis talk about the obscuring egoism. And when the obscuring egoism has been stripped away, we discover the divine presence at the heart of our own being. We discover the divine presence as the heart of our own being, with greater self-realization, greater self-control. We come bounding back more fully human, with the ideal humanness that God intended all along. And if you remember the story of Anthony of the desert, after 40 years in the tombs, they break him out and he comes out of the tombs like shining like the sun. And they say he's not too fat from lack of exercise, he's not too skinny from fasting, but he's in his right mind, and he's cut the phison, St. Athanasius tells us. He's according to nature. His years of asceticism, his union with God, has turned him into a real human being, and also turned him into a divinized human being. And a divinized human being is a full human being still. That's what it looks like to be divinized. It means to be fully human, fully alive. The glory of God is the human person fully alive. I bring up some of these ideas from the Sufi tradition just to let me see something of our own mystical theology in a new light in some way. The great British scholar Karen Armstrong, who knows both the Muslim tradition and the Christian tradition quite well, suggests that what the Sufis are describing here is that same state that the Greek Christians call deification, when we get deified, when we get to share the divinity of Christ, who humbled himself to share in our humanity. There's a beautiful poem by St. Bernard of Clairvaux. I'm surprised I'd never seen it before until a couple of years ago, where he could be writing either as a Sufi or as a Hindu Advaitin. And here's this strange tension between the self and the disappearance of the self, and what abides of the self after this experience. Beautiful poem. He says, as a drop of water seems to disappear completely in a big quantity of wine, even assuming the wine's taste and color. Just as red molten iron becomes so much like fire that it seems to lose its primary state. Just as the air on a sunny day seems like it's transformed into sunshine instead of being lit up. So it's necessary for the saints that all human feeling melt in a mysterious way, dissolvi, and flow into the will of God. And then he asks that question: does something human in us survive? No doubt substance remains, though under another form, another glory, another power. Otherwise, how will God be all in all? So it's necessary at some point that all of our human feeling melt in a mysterious way and flow into the will of God. Something human in us survive? Yes, no doubt something remains under another form, another glory, another power. And about that glory and that power, these last two things, one from 2 Corinthians, this is the promise. This is, like, for me, the mystical tradition of Christianity at its most refined. And all of us with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror, we're being transformed into that same image. From one degree of glory to another, one degree of glory to another. And the last is my friend Claire of Assisi again, writing to her sister Agnes. Jesus is the brightness of eternal light and a mirror without a cloud. So look into that mirror every day and study well your own reflection. No, we'll sing again to end our session today. As we have died with you, we are raised to a new life in you. Change us into what we receive. By the one who caused the virgin birth, cause your spotless bride to bring forth children beyond count, not of human blood nor by desire of the flesh, not born of human will but born of God. As we have died with you, we are raised to a new life in you. Change us into what we receive. Okay, everybody. Have a great day. See you in the morning.
Thank you.